Welcome back to the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. So today's episode, we've had a brilliant listener question come through about landlord strategy and rent setting. So right up Cate's alley today. So our listener, Lukasz, writes to us and says, I'm really enjoying your podcast. Your episode drops can't come fast enough. I particularly appreciate...
I love that.
It is great to hear. Though we'll still, unfortunately for Lukasz, stick to one a week because that's hard enough for us to make happen. I particularly appreciate your technical and strategic lessons. So Lukasz says, I own 4 properties, 1 principal place of residence and 3 investments. And he says, I'm late to the party learning about investment grade with a hand emoji with a hand on his face. So I assume that he may have made 1 or 2 purchases that he regrets, but that's very often part of the journey. I'm interested in the topic of landlord strategy, specifically regarding rent. I see this as my biggest weakness as an investor. A gentleman I look up to in property believes in always seeking the highest rent possible, but this hasn't worked for me. I understand why one would seek the highest price when selling a property, as there are no legacy consequences because of no ongoing relationship with the buyer. In this example, however, when you're renting, the quality of the tenant, when you sell, the quality of the tenant isn't important. However, with an ongoing renter, we create an ongoing relationship and their quality matters. When I've tried to skim the best rent the market will bear, I've received few applications, and these have turned out to be low quality options that have turned into issues with some tenants. I wonder if these low quality tenants need to pay top dollar because they've burned monetary bridges, kind of how those with poor financial records pay the highest rates reflecting their credit ratings. So I'm now migrating to a philosophy of asking a 5 to 10% discount to the market to generate more applicants and increase my chances of finding a good quality tenant. I anticipate the discount will buy me fewer headaches down the track. What are your thoughts on this, and what are some of the landlord strategies you employ with your own investment properties when it comes to and setting rents? Right. Well, look, that's a fantastic question, Lukasz. We love you sending that in and giving us such fantastic detail and background on your journey. So, Cate, I'll start with you. Is chasing the absolute highest rent always the smartest strategy?
The short answer is no. And Lukasz said a couple of things that were really pertinent. It's so interesting that he's now discounting 5 to 10% after having someone that he looked up to saying, go for the highest. You know, he's obviously been burnt enough that he's adopted a different strategy. The other thing that Lukasz said that I thought was a really clever parallel was those with, credit issues or a history with their borrowing that means that they can't get a loan that might have a sharp rate. They pay the higher rate. He had that parallel in his note to us, and I think it's a really good one because, that is true. He's learnt the hard way, but there are 2 risks to this approach. The highest advertised rent doesn't always equal the best financial outcome to start with. If a property sits vacant for 2 weeks while you hold out for another $20 or $30 a week, you can easily lose more than you gain. And beyond the vacancy, which he's really alluding to, the real issue is the applicant quality. If your rent is pushed too high, you often reduce the pool of strong applicants and you might only attract tenants who are struggling to secure something else. That can create a higher risk around arrears, care of the property or lease stability or, other issues that tenants with not so great records can find themselves documented about. I've seen enough situations where this has played out, and I can't stress it enough with my current clients that the overpriced rental strategy, it carries enormous risk. So realistic pricing creates competition, more applications, and a broader choice, which ultimately gives you an opportunity to get, I don't like the word quality put next to tenant, but a more suitable tenant to your property and to your risk profile.
Yeah, that's such an important point, Cate. Just if anyone's watching on YouTube, our electricians are in the house at the moment and the lights are not on.
You're going to say they're wearing no tops or something. I was about to get excited.
So, yeah.
Gosh, we need the views, Tate. Just do whatever you can.
Yeah. Well, they'll occasionally walk past with no tops on. No. So I do have lamps on my desk, but if it's dark in the background, it's the
You're
electricians
doing all
are
right,
here.
Dave. Yeah, you're in the Philippines having a brown out.
Yeah. So, Mike, what are some of the hidden costs landlords forget when trying to squeeze every last dollar of rent?
Yeah, well, there's heaps, and I love this question, and Cate picked up on the parallel from the question. That's absolutely true. Sometimes people will just breeze in and go, look, I'll pay extra on top, or if you are trying to get the maximum, you will get those people that swoop in because they've got a poor history or no history at all, which can be a good and it can be a bad thing. But if you focus too much on that weekly rent, you forget a lot of the other things that can go wrong, like the costs of vacancy. Like I'd much rather someone paying a couple of percentage less that has a long-term focus, because I'm always looking for long-term tenancies. Things like reletting fees and advertising that come with the vacancy, cleaning, repairs, and the stress of or just having a poor tenancy. I've inspected thousands and thousands of properties over the years with tenants in place. And often I've been used as a bargaining chip with the landlord, i.e., I will not let the quantity surveyor in until you fix the tap or the fly screen. And what strikes me a lot of the time is sure, maybe not always the tenant is being reasonable, but they're often very, very low cost repairs. So something that might cost sub $200 or $300, the damage that a disgruntled tenant can do, or just the neglect that they can sort of perpetuate within a property. For example, a tenant can go like, oh yeah, I see a little bit of mold or I see a leak. I'm not going to let the landlord know because they haven't done this for me or they haven't done that for me. That's where I think people get really, really short-sighted. And at the end of the day, as a landlord, I feel like we have a responsibility to provide a safe and comfortable place. And the swap for that is you have hopefully someone that pays the reasonable rent and looks after the property. So I just wanted to make that point. A smooth tenancy with someone that's on time, stays for longer, looks after the property, I mean, that is worth a hell of a lot more than $5 or $10 a week. And I think people get a little bit too short-sighted with it.
Yeah, great summary, Mike. So, Cate, our listener mentioned offering a 5 to 10% discount to attract more applicants. Is that a smart move?
It can be if it's strategic rather than emotional. But in this climate, with vacancy rates so tight, I can't help but fear that Lukasz is selling himself short. I wouldn't automatically discount a property at all, but pricing slightly below the top of the market can absolutely generate stronger inquiry and multiple quality applicants. And, if we've got a looser vacancy rate climate, or if the property's quirky or you're not getting the hits, there are all kinds of things that you can do when your advertising is not bringing in the numbers that you'd expect. Maybe you got your market rates wrong. They're the times that I would consider discounting, but not when I've got really clear market appraisals that suggest that I'm bang on and we've got a healthy climate. I'd like to specifically run through all of Lukasz's property locations though, before I'd go saying to him, yeah, blanket approach, discount. I want to understand, whether he's got some of these slower locations or quirkier properties that need him to be proactive with just getting a tenant in and reducing his vacancy period. His strategy is not flawed if he's struggling with vacancies or, if the properties are quirky. But when several strong applicants are competing, landlords can select the best overall fit rather than just taking the only available option. So, that would be one reason to reduce it slightly. If you're just getting one applicant and they're not ideal, in this climate, I always say to my clients, you want to get at least 3 applicants when you've had a really good showing. So, in the first week, we typically find that our clients' properties are leasing after 1 open. And if it's well presented and it's well priced, then you'd expect about 3. If you're only getting 1, it doesn't mean it's bad. You might get the person who's perfect for the property, but you ideally want to have a bit of choice.
Yeah, some great points there, Cate. So one thing that Lukasz should really assess is considering the property by property and location by location. So better quality properties and locations should require less of a discount, whereas more flawed properties or less desirable locations will present greater tenancy risk. The approach needs to be specific and nuanced based on each individual property. And so that's an important takeaway for our listeners. So, Cate, how often should landlords review rent?
At a minimum, every 12 months. Our legislation is different across our states and territories, but most jurisdictions only permit a change of rental every year. But when you've got the opportunity to review your rents, you might have to move them, whether it's moving them up or down. Sometimes, as an investor, I've often found that rents have been static and there hasn't been a justified reason to change the rent. In fact, in past years, we've occasionally had to reduce personally. But as I mentioned earlier, this climate is different. We talk about rising rents in every market update, and it's almost completely across the board right now that rents are rising, in every city. So the best approach is regular reviews based on current market evidence and good guidance from the property manager. And as I've said before, sitting tight on asking rents out of a sense of kindness to a tenant, that can really backfire.
That sounds like it might be based on a personal experience, Cate. Is that what you're talking about, or what?
Absolutely, it is. Look, I've seen a lot of people do it. You'd be surprised how many investors I work with that want to be that amazing landlord, and they're really kind, and being too kind can bite you. So what I mean by that is letting a tenant's asking rent slide to being under market. It doesn't bode well for future rental evaluations. So, for example, if the rental slips below $50 per week under market, it's a really rude shock for the tenant next time you do contemplate bringing them up to market value. And if they leave out of protest, their comparable property options will be really tough. That will be such a difficult shock for them. Also, they might have a strong and defensible position if they want to challenge you on the basis of it being an out of fairness rent rise. And all they need to do is go to the legislator. So that some legislations protect the tenants against rent rises that eclipse CPI. So just because you've enabled the tenant to enjoy the rent in prior years below market rent doesn't mean you'll get away with all of a sudden bringing them up to market rent with a sharp increase. You might find yourself at the tribunal.
So you could get stung, for example, because the percentage rate of growth was actually too high, even though you're only bringing it back to market. Like you're actually causing a problem for yourself by leaving it under. And then they might say, well, rent's gone up 15%, but there's nothing to support 15% rental growth in that region. So it could be thrown out in the tribunal, right?
Yes. And I've found over history, talking to property managers that have had to defend rental increases at the tribunal, members, so that, like the judge, they're not all the same. Not every case is the same. It's how it's presented. It's the strength of the argument. It's the position of the renter. All of that stuff is taken into account. But I've definitely seen rent increases that might have been market price justified, but the increase itself, the magnitude of the increase was too much. I've seen that get thrown out. So you do have to think carefully about playing a really straight bat every year. You can't just go soft one year and then bring it up. Your personal situation changes and interest rates have increased, and all of a sudden you can't afford to be as kind as you've been exercising. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. I mean, your personal situation and circumstances might change unexpectedly or abruptly, and then you wish you had been charging market rent and getting the best possible dollar, and you need that extra cash, and you're just not in a position to make those changes on the spot and automatically, because, as you've said, you might run foul of the rules and regulations for that state. And you might just lose a tenant and create more headaches and less time without any rental income finding a new tenant. So, yeah, there's a bunch of reasons to consider why you should be trying to charge market rent all the time. Cate, let's now talk about the phasing of rental cycles for investors as well. So, what I'm focusing on is an investor's exposure to multiple vacancies at any one time. So obviously, someone who has a portfolio of properties,
Yep.
how do you guard against that for your
It's a great
clients?
question. Yeah. While some areas thrive with a particular letting month, I'm thinking out loud, Ballarat. It's a university town. It's all of your professional renters are usually on contract. It's got a large hospital and then a cancer centre and university employment for lecturers and academics. Like that's a market that goes off the dial every January. So if you had 3 properties in Ballarat, you'd ideally want to phase them all in January because that's the time. But you do have to think strategically about what phase all of your properties are in when you're a multi-property portfolio holder, because you can get yourself in trouble when vacancy rates aren't tight. It's not always a great move to have all of your fixed rental periods finishing in Jan. It's an exposure, particularly when the rental markets are softer. So I prefer to discuss phasing rental periods so that these cash flow vulnerabilities are minimised. The period that I would typically avoid in a colder climate area is winter, because tenants don't love moving in winter. The other one is December. Once we get into that second week of December, your tenant doesn't want to move. No one wants to organise a removals truck and, pack up the Christmas tree. It's not on.
Yeah, those are some really good insights, Cate. And Lukasz is really a multi-portfolio property owner, and he's chastising himself for not being across rent as good as he thinks, but he's in the top 10% of property investors. And if I know Lukasz, this won't be the last one. There's probably going to be a couple more along the way. I don't know Lukasz, but I just, you can pick it up through the questions sometimes. Yeah.
It is the vibe.
Notwithstanding Kate's points that there are certain times within the year that it doesn't make sense to have the rental expiry. You obviously don't want them to all expire in the same month, because if there's a risk that they could all be vacant at one particular point in time. And if you are a portfolio property owner, that could be thousands of dollars a week that you've got to find from somewhere. But if you can stagger the lease expiry and avoid those dead periods that Cate was talking about, of course you can spread the risk. If you do have a vacancy, and it might just be that tenant's moving and it takes a week to get somebody in, or you take the advantage to do a little bit of cleaning, whatever you want to do, you've still got the others that are producing that income. It also kind of reduces your own workload, because the property manager is going to want to be talking to you about, okay, well, this is what I think market rent is. What do you want to do? Do you want to take the opportunity to do something during a vacancy period? And it gives you time to also prepare for that conversation. A good property manager solves a lot of these problems, but I don't like the idea of a landlord not being an active participant in that. Ideally, before the rental expiry is 30 days away, you have an idea about what market rent is, and you have an idea and you have a look at the comparables, so you can have a more robust discussion with the property manager at that time.
So, Cate, where does a property manager fit into all of this?
Yeah, a good one is absolutely critical. I am never, ever going to put my hand up to manage my own properties, and I will never encourage anyone else to do it either. A great property manager helps set the right rent. They screen the tenants thoroughly. They manage arrears really quickly. They communicate really well, and they keep your maintenance and also not just maintenance, but guarding against things that can become maintenance issues is also. They keep all of that under control. They manage and maintain your property. They also know the local market, so they can advise whether to push the rents, hold steady, sharpen pricing, do things a little bit differently to get inquiry going. And the difference between an average property manager and an excellent one can be thousands of dollars over time, and a lot of stress and a lot of wasted time. So for our listeners who want to tune into one of our backlog eps on this very issue, they should go back to our earlier episode, and we'll list that at the end. We did one extensively on property managers quite a while ago with the property professor, I remember, Dave.
Yeah, so we'll get Anne-Marie to mention that in the related episodes that she runs through at the end of each episode. And actually, on that note, I really encourage all our listeners to go back and listen to our full back catalogue of episodes, as we've covered so many great topics since the start of the series. And actually, like, a lot of the core fundamentals of property and mortgage strategy are inside of our first 50 episodes. So,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of the questions we answer in a couple minutes in each episode are unpacked in more detail across an entire episode in the previous sort of 360 episodes. So, yeah, so for those yet to listen to the back catalogue, we really encourage you to go back, work through them all to ground your knowledge even further.
You know, Dave, I was just thinking, like, I think it was this week, 7 years ago,
Is it?
we recorded our,
Yeah, okay. So it's 7 years.
been a long
There you
time.
go.
And we
Happy
tried
podcast
at the
birthday.
start, and what was that?
Happy podcast birthday.
It is. We tried at the start to be as timeless as we could. We wanted to, you know, cover concepts really in detail. And then, of course, you know, we are time sensitive with all of our COVID commentary, and that carried for a long time. And, you know, we had a lot of listeners join on then just to get some information about what was actually happening. So sometimes you get stuff that's time-stamped, but I agree with you. I think the first 50, you get a really good grasp on investment philosophy.
100%. And you can roll through then episode by episode. And if there's one that you think you don't want to listen to as much, or you don't feel like you need that knowledge, obviously you can just skip that one. So
Fast forward.
All right. So back to today's episode. Our listener has also asked about some good strategies with setting rent. Cate, what pearls of wisdom do you have here for Lukasz?
We've spoken about setting rent, getting a great tenant, minimising vacancy, but we haven't spoken about keeping a good tenant. And like anything in business, retention should be the key focus. Things like a longer fixed tenancy period can be a good idea for someone that values that tenure. And you'll see it more today than in previous years. I've been investing for a long time, and we've always offered multiple years of tenancy tenures to really good tenants that we've thought are great for the property, and no one takes you up on it. But these days I've started to hear more of that because, you know, the vacancy rates are tighter, and we've had a lot of investor-led sales, and a lot of renters just want to be able to call their place home for more than 1 year. So things like longer fixed tenancy periods, that can work, but not every tenant wants to be locked into a longer fixed period, so that's not your only lever. Letting your tenants know that you're responsive, respectful and proud of your property, they're really valuable traits of a good landlord. And you won't be able to let them know that unless you've got a great property manager who's a good communicator. Because if they're just transactional or they're not talking much to their tenant, the tenant won't necessarily pick up on that stuff. I mean, as a landlord, I pride myself on fixing things and seeing to every maintenance request. A great tenant is a valuable part to the whole investing adventure, and I always feel sad when a great tenant decides to move on. Sometimes it's poor communication between them and the property manager. Other times it's a poorly selected tenant, you know, they're not suitable to the property. Both of these are pretty unforgivable in my view. A good property manager isn't just super organised and responsive though. They're great communicators. They're good at matching the right tenants to the right property.
It's an interesting point you made, Cate. You spoke about the tight rental vacancies in the climate, and of course there are some pockets where there is choice, but in a lot of places around the country it is very tight. But what's your attitude about taking time to get the right tenant when you might be sort of seeing a sea of applicants?
I would rather have 2 weeks of vacancy and find that money to cover the mortgage than a tenant who isn't the right fit for the property. I've pushed back before when, you know, younger property managers have tried to forward me an application just because they're getting nervous that I might get edgy about the lack of rent. And I have to say to them, look, I'm not excited about months of no rent, but weeks of no rent, no problem. It's factored in. Take your time, breathe. Don't worry about calling me every day. Like, I promise you I'm okay. Find me the right renter for the property. Get someone who's going to fit this house really well and love it. don't feel like you need to just present anyone. I don't want a 7 out of 10. I want a 9 point something. So I think that's really important for all of us to note, because if you take 3 weeks to find the right tenant and they love the property and they're right for it, they've got the right income to stay there, and then they stay with you for 3 years, that 3 weeks worth of vacancy was absolutely worth it. So, I have to always be really firm with the property manager that that's not a key concern for me. I will reward them more for quality than for quantity.
Cate, I think another area where sometimes landlords can skimp and cost themselves with tenants and create headaches is not fixing repairs and maintenance quickly and not doing it properly or well. And what are your thoughts there?
I agree completely, Dave. Getting the right trades and applying the right fix means that the issue is sorted. And then there are 2 benefits. You're not bothering your tenant with them feeling awkward about ringing up and saying it's broken again. You're not putting them out, having trades come through. You're not having to, get another set of quotes. But more importantly, you're stopping the issue so that if it's water related, which they often are, you're stopping any water ingress. If you've got a slow leak or a little bit of dampness, or they're bumbling along getting by with this issue, but the bathroom floor is always satched, you're creating a bigger headache and a really expensive problem for yourself down the track. So I think landlords that don't respond to call-outs are crazy, because they might have a maintenance issue that will turn it from being a little Band-Aid job to a full take it to hospital job. And they also annoy the tenants. And tenants can, I've met that many new onboarded tenants over the years. Sometimes they come in with an attitude and you get the request and it's aggressive and they're annoyed, and you can just tell they don't like the landlord. And I think to myself, well, they haven't dealt with us yet, because we're not like that. And we can't get our back up. I have to say to my husband, no, don't fret about that. They've probably had 15 years worth of really horrible experiences with landlords that haven't reacted and fixed the issue. They're just frustrated. So let's prove to them that not only will we fix it, we'll thank them for bringing it to our attention. And if your property manager doesn't report stuff, my pet hate, I've got a few, but one of them is when I walk through and I say, "Good day, hi, I'm Cate. Is everything going all right? We lived here once upon a time," whatever the story is. Is there anything that you want to tell me? Anything that's annoying you, that's not working, anything broken, anything on its way out? And you're just giving them your time. You're looking them in the eye. They can see that you're not setting them up for failure. You're actually wanting to know that your property's in good shape. We've got old properties. I often say, this thing's a period house. I want to stay on top of every issue. Is there anything you can think of that we haven't done or that you might not have mentioned? And then the property manager gets a bit awkward. And then they look at each other and, oh, yeah, that thing. Yes, Cate, I was going to talk to you about that. That property manager, they're not going to stay with me for very long. No. That for me is an unforgivable offence.
Yeah, I think they're great examples and a great summary. And, at times as a landlord, you can get caught up in trying to keep your own costs down, but you really want to put yourself in the tenant's shoes. And no one wants to be going to a house each day to live in and spend your time in, and there's something that really annoys you that means you don't enjoy living in that property. And, you're going to look to move out, and you might have had a really good tenant, but because you've skimped on some areas and just not done things properly, it's actually going to cost you in the long run.
Yes, and I feel for tenants. I really do. I think I've mentioned it once before. We've got a really lovely renter in one of our properties, and we did I did the inspection, and the oven door wasn't closing like this. It wasn't about the seal. The door, the mechanism, the spring kind of loaded mechanism wasn't letting it shut. So, of course, they can't use the oven. So they've got this weird cooker thing on the bench that they've probably picked up at Aldi. And I wanted to find out what's going on. I could see there was something wrong with the oven. And I said, "How long has it been like that?" "Oh, it doesn't matter." I said, "No, it does matter. You guys deserve an oven." No. We don't want you to put the rent up. And my heart sank. I just said, it doesn't work like that. We've been your landlord for a long time. That's not how we roll.
Yeah. No, very good. I think that's all really useful for our listeners and landlords and budding landlords to take in and absorb. So Look, one thing from part of what you were saying earlier on in that little sequence of discussion, maximum rent doesn't always mean maximum return, does it?
I think that's a fairly good way to sum it up, Dave. At the end of the day, the game isn't really about rents, it's about leveraged appreciating assets. Those are the properties themselves. Of course, rent is important because you need the cash flow to be able to support these things, and that matters not just to you, but also to the financier that's maybe helping Lukasz to get to the next one, right? But forcing the absolute maximum rent at the expense of the risk of vacancies or a bad tenant experience is a fairly nearsighted thing to do, I think.
100% agree.
I think we've got to keep our eye on the prize here, and there are always the investors that have gone for the yield model. So that's a bit of a different situation. Most of our listeners and most of my clients are in it for capital growth, and they might need it to be a bit more balanced. In other words, they'll need a stronger yield than normal. But not many investors these days are just buying for yield. And you've got such high costs of maintenance and compliance and taxes and things like that. It's not a model that's worked so well. So if we're standing back and recognising that this is a long game, it's all about capital growth, a sustainable income, asset protection, good management. All of those things beat the short-term sugar hit with a burst of strong rental. And over time, of course, we've talked about it before, and Dave, you've made this point in a really clear way. Your rate of capital growth long-term should be very similar to your rate of rental growth. So your rent will grow. It'll take care of itself. Just do what you can do to make the journey a bit easier. And the way to have a great journey that's easy is no vacancy, an appreciative tenant that communicates well, so that you've got a stress-free tenancy. I think that's it.
I think, Cate, even if we are going for a high-yielding strategy, our methodology is that we want to buy, small boarding homes that are 11, 12% yield. The same principles apply, right? Let's say one of the rooms is worth 180 a week and you try for the 220 and you get one applicant. That differential can be eaten up very, very quickly with a tenant who doesn't care about the property, a tenant who falls behind. They don't mention maintenance issues. They become disgruntled. Like, think of the damage that a tenant can create within a property through neglect or through malice. And often the bond, it's not so simple as, okay, well, they've done this damage, we'll just take it out of the bond. Often it ends up in the tribunal. That can be extra PM costs. That's extra stress. So
it's horrible.
Regardless, I think, of your investment strategy, it's important, right?
You've made a really good point, Mike. For one of those multi-tenancy properties where you have got an investor that's really focused on bolstering up the rent, I think they're more vulnerable than anyone to seeking out the highest paying tenant who might be troublesome, because you're not just dealing with a house and a tenant. You've then got the knock-on effect of all of the other residents. And imagine having one troublemaker in a 3, 4, 5, 6 person house. What a nightmare.
Yeah, 100%. And even if you go looking at boarding houses and you get much greater yields and you want to go down that path, you've got more people to manage. There's going to be more time in the upkeep of the property, dealing with each individual tenant. I mean, I've known quite well an investor who owned multiple boarding houses in Sydney, and they're great return, and he's been very successful. But he spends a lot of time, and that's his game. Property's his game.
You're pretty hands-on, aren't you?
Yeah, he's really hands-on.
Remember years ago we did an ep with Pete on our property nightmares or something like that, and there was one property that I bought and then sold within 2 years because it was such a nightmare. We couldn't even talk about it on air, remember?
I do, yeah. I was about to say a town of where I think they were, but I won't air that town.
No, we won't do that. But the point was, that was a yield play and it was a multi-tenancy setup. And I was young. It was before I was a buyer's agent. And it was a really good, hard, valuable lesson It was bad. You know, the police would call us pretty much every Saturday.
Yeah, I do remember that conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it's a reasonable point. You know, this isn't a exact correlation, but when you are going for higher yield, you might have more tenancy challenges. And there's various reasons for that, but we won't necessarily unpack those today because that's just about the end of our episode. So I love it. That was a great question from Lukasz, and will be hopefully we unpacked a lot of great aspects to his question for Lukasz, as well as our landlord listeners and those who want to become landlords down the track. So stay with us. We've got our gold nuggets coming up.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
Okay, so my gold nugget, and this is certainly something Cate has talked a lot about over our episodes, is take the time to get a great property manager. Ring around, ask other people about their thoughts and experiences on local property managers, and don't simply select the property manager from the agency who you purchase the property through, or some other option that is just like the first thing that gets recommended to you or the easiest option. It's really important to get the property manager right. And if you do, you'll make more money and perhaps even more importantly, have less headaches and spend less time on tenant management.
I've got to wait and do it carefully gold nugget as well. And mine is get your property in tip-top condition before you put the tenant in there. So if that means, you know, if you're lucky, you'll have a tenant for multiple years, eventually they'll move on. Don't be in a hurry to have no gap and to quickly let it again, unless you absolutely know that it's tip-top. Take the time, because there are two reasons. Firstly, you'll fix those issues that might lead to further degradation, you know, issues that might need an invasive amount of work by tradespeople that you wouldn't usually put a tenant through. So they might be lifting floorboards or, you know, doing some things that you'd ordinarily not want a tenant to be around for. And then the second reason is when a tenant gets a property that's in tip-top condition, they're obliged to, obviously outside of fair wear and tear, they're obliged to return it in the same condition, but also they'll feel the sense of pride that you've had in the property and they'll appreciate its condition, and they'll be more likely to deliver it back in a similar condition.
I've got
What's yours,
three.
Mike?
Three quick tips. It's probably not going to be quick. I'll try my best. One is don't forget that repairs and maintenance or any updates are tax deductible, right? So what you're outlaying is not necessarily what it costs. You know, I've got to throw in my resident tax nerd stuff. Another thing is that if you are, I mean, getting the right property manager is absolutely critical, right? And one thing that I've asked my mother to do when she was looking for a selling agent is ring them up on one of their listings. So, for example, if you're shopping around for property managers, inquire on a property. Just sort of say, I'm interested in renting this property. See what level of service you get, because there shouldn't be a huge differential between someone that's wanting to list their property for rent with an agency compared to a tenant who's looking for a property. But I bet you'll find more often than not, those tenants making those inquiries are the second-class citizens of that agency, and they really roll out the red carpet if you're saying, I'm thinking of using you as a property manager. That tenant needs a level of respect. They need a level of care, and a property manager that treats you like a number when you're doing that test is not the right person for you. Last one I've got is I've interviewed a number of commercial property experts, and the DD that they do around tenants is massive. And of course, it's different. It's baked into really the valuation of the commercial property itself, so that it's not a like for like comparison. However, I feel like we could borrow some ideas from the DD that commercial property purchasers
Due diligence.
do. Yes. Sorry, Dave. I'm just throwing out some acronyms there.
Yeah.
So
I think that's an awesome approach.
Yeah, so for
All
example,
three of them.
The commercial person will be saying, okay, well, what are your plans in place? Are you expanding your business? Is this fit for purpose? Do you have other sites? And the parallel would be, well, what are your plans in the next few years? Are you staying in place? Are you looking for a long-term tenancy? And these are questions that can be happening before you even pick the tenant. So I've hogged the gold nuggets, but I just wanted to throw those three out at Lukasz and anyone else listening.
Hog away. It's been great. 5 gold nuggets.
Our
Bonus.
listeners have got extra gold today. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Cate, for your input and prep for today's episode. And a huge thanks to Lukasz for his great questions, and well done on your property journey so far, Lukasz.
Yeah, 100% echoing that. Thank you.
So until next week, we look forward to seeing you all again, or listening to you, or you listening to us all in a week's
Look
time.
forward to catching you.
Yeah.
Awesome.
See you then.
Good to see you guys.